The Bennett family was everything you'd hope for in a neighbor. Living in a quiet Aurora, Colorado, suburb, Bruce and Deborah Bennett were raising their two daughters with love, care, and devotion. Bruce, just 27 years old, was hardworking and ambitious, managing a furniture store and taking steps to secure a bright future for his family. Deborah, at 26, was described by friends as warm and nurturing, a dedicated mother and loving wife. Their daughters, 7-year-old Melissa and 3-year-old Vanessa, were the light of their lives. Melissa was a bright, inquisitive child who adored reading and playing with her little sister, while Vanessa was a spirited toddler, always curious and full of laughter. The Bennetts had recently moved into their home on East Center Drive, a modest but cozy house in a safe neighborhood. The community was close-knit, the kind of place where children played freely outside, and neighbors often left their doors unlocked. For the Bennetts, life seemed perfect, until the night of January 15, 1984, when their world would be torn apart. That Sunday began like any other weekend day. Bruce spent time with the family, running errands and preparing for the week ahead. Deborah cooked dinner, and the girls played in the living room. It was a peaceful, ordinary evening, the kind of night that would later haunt those who knew them. No one could have imagined that within hours, this loving family would fall victim to one of Colorado's most brutal and senseless crimes. The next morning, Bruce's mother, Connie, grew concerned when the family didn't show up for work or school. This was highly unusual. Bruce was dependable and punctual, and he always kept in close contact with his family. Worried, Connie decided to check on them. What she found inside the house would haunt her for the rest of her life. Inside the Bennett home was a scene of unimaginable horror. Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa had been brutally murdered, their bodies bearing the marks of a violent attack. Bruce's body was found near the stairs, indicating he had fought desperately to protect his family. Deborah was discovered in the bedroom, and Melissa was in her own room, her small frame bearing the same brutal injuries as her parents. The youngest, Vanessa, was found alive but gravely injured. Her skull was fractured, and her jaw was broken. Rushed to the hospital, she clung to life by a thread. The sheer brutality of the crime shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The killer had used a hammer and a knife, leaving a trail of devastation. The family's injuries suggested that the attack was both personal and frenzied, yet the motive was unclear. While some valuables were missing, the primary focus appeared to be violence rather than robbery. The community of Aurora was paralyzed with fear. How could such a horrific crime occur in a safe, suburban neighborhood? Parents began locking their doors at night, and neighbors grew suspicious of one another. As the investigation began, police faced an uphill battle. The crime scene was chaotic, with little physical evidence to identify a suspect. Detectives interviewed neighbors and canvassed the area, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual that night. The investigation into the Bennett family murders quickly became one of the largest in Aurora's history. Detectives explored every possible lead, from known criminals in the area to drifters passing through town. Forensic experts analyzed the hammer and knife wounds, hoping to find unique patterns that could link the crime to other cases. Early on, investigators theorized that the killer may have been a burglar surprised by the family's presence, leading to the violent attack. But as weeks turned into months, leads dried up, and the case went cold. For decades, the murders of the Bennett family remained unsolved. The community mourned the loss of Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa while rallying around young Vanessa, who survived against all odds. Vanessa's recovery was long and arduous. She endured multiple surgeries to repair the damage caused by the attack and faced years of emotional and psychological trauma. Despite this, she grew up determined to honor her family's memory and build a life of her own. The case took a dramatic turn in 2002, nearly 20 years after the murders. Advances in DNA technology allowed forensic experts to re-examine evidence from the crime scene. A DNA profile was extracted from the evidence and entered into the national database. To the shock of investigators, the DNA matched samples from two other unsolved murders in the Denver area, the rape and murder of Patricia Louise Smith in Lakewood, just a week before the Bennett murders, and an attack on another family in Aurora. These connections confirmed that the Bennett family's killer was a serial predator who had struck multiple times. Despite this breakthrough, the identity of the killer remained a mystery. The DNA profile did not match anyone in the database, leaving investigators frustrated and the community still searching for answers. It wasn't until 2018 that a revolutionary technique called familial DNA searching provided the final piece of the puzzle. This method uses partial DNA matches to identify potential relatives of the perpetrator, leading investigators to Alex Ewing, a man serving time in Nevada for unrelated crimes. Ewing's DNA was a perfect match for the evidence from the Bennett crime scene. He had a history of violent offenses, including attacks on other families, and his methods matched the brutality of the Bennett murders. In 2020, Ewing was extradited to Colorado to face charges for the murders of Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa Bennett, as well as the murder of Patricia Smith. The trial that followed was one of the most emotionally charged in Colorado's history. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including the DNA match, forensic analysis, and testimonies from experts who described Ewing's violent tendencies. They argued that Ewing had broken into the Bennett home with the intent to commit burglary but had turned to violence when he encountered the family. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the reliability of the DNA evidence, but their arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming case against Ewing. The courtroom was filled with emotion as Vanessa, now an adult, took the stand. She spoke of her family, their love, and the devastating loss she had endured. Her testimony was a powerful reminder of the human cost of Ewing's actions. Family members and friends shared their memories of Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa, painting a picture of a loving family whose lives were stolen in an instant. In 2021, Alex Ewing was found guilty of the Bennett family murders and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought a sense of closure to the community and to Vanessa, who had waited decades for justice. While no punishment could ever undo the pain of losing her family, the conviction ensured that Ewing would never harm another innocent person. The Bennett family murders remain a dark chapter in Colorado's history, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. Their story is one of tragedy and resilience, of a community's determination to seek justice and honor the memory of those lost. Vanessa's survival and strength serve as a testament to the power of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable loss.
I just want to say I'm very happy that it's all over. It's been a long time waiting for this. Really happened with the prosecution team. They've really done a great job.
Thank you, Your Honor. This case comes down to 2 things.
Can you stand behind the podium, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Those 2 things are semen and similarities. That's because it's semen and similarities that prove it was the defendant who sexually assaulted and killed Patricia Smith on January 10th, 1984. Let's talk about semen. When the defendant sexually assaulted Patricia Smith, he leaves behind his ejaculate on her genital area, on the carpet beneath her body, and on the blanket he draped over her head that he'd smashed in with a hammer. Let's talk about similarities. 6 days later, the defendant kills and sexually assaults 3 members of the Bennett family and sexually assaults one of them in such a similar way that you can consider that evidence as it goes to the defendant's modus operandi, or MO, common plan, and his identity as Patricia Smith's murderer. Remember, this case comes down to semen and similarities because that is the evidence that proves the defendant is guilty of these crimes. Before we get into that evidence, let's go back. This is Patricia Smith. It's Tuesday, January 10th, 1984. She lives in her Lakewood townhome with her 29-year-old daughter, Sherry Letton, and her 2 kids, 3-year-old Joe and 5-year-old Amber. They live in this townhome and they're going about their morning. It's a pretty typical day. Patricia Smith drives her daughter Sherry to the park and ride so that Sherry can get to work, takes her grandkids to daycare, and then she goes about her day. She was an interior designer. She goes to the dry cleaners midday, she picks up some Wendy's for lunch, and then she goes back home. She goes up to her bedroom, turns on the TV, starts eating her hamburger. Meanwhile, the defendant sees vulnerability and takes advantage of that. That vulnerability is caused by two things. Patricia Smith, when she parked her car in her garage, left her garage door open. In between the garage, which wasn't attached, and the townhome, this vestibule area, that front door she also left unlocked. The defendant goes into her townhome and he has a hammer. He bludgeons Patricia Smith at her front door, and she doesn't make it past her living room, several feet away. That's where he bludgeons her head, killing her, and also sexually assaults her. Sherry Letton is waiting for her mom to pick her up at the park and ride at 5:30 p.m. that evening. But her mom doesn't show up, which is unlike her. So she calls from a payphone. Remember, this is 1984, but her mom doesn't pick up. So she calls her cousin to come pick her up from the park and ride. They go pick up Patricia Smith's grandkids, Sherry's kids, from daycare, and go home. Immediately, Sherry Letton notices that things seem a little bit off. Her mom's car is in the garage, but the door's open, the garage door. It's dark outside by then, but there's no lights. There are no lights on inside the townhome. She can just see the flickering of her mom's TV in the bedroom. She goes through that open garage door and then through the unlocked front door and immediately sees her mother lying deceased in a pool of blood around her head. Naked, with her blouse, sweater, and unclasped bra around her shoulder area, her boots and jeans and underwear strewn around her along with buttons from that blouse, and her legs spread apart. Sherry Letton rushes over to a neighbor's home who comes over and confirms that her mother is in fact dead, and they call 911. The criminal investigation begins. But let's fast forward 6 days. 6 days later, the defendant is still on the loose, and he targets a family in Aurora, Colorado. This is the Bennett family: Bruce Bennett, Deborah Bennett, Vanessa, and Melissa Bennett. The defendant targets this family 6 days later. You can consider this evidence for a limited purpose: the defendant's MO, his common plan, and his identity as Patricia Smith's perpetrator and assailant. So what does he do? Let's go back to January 15th. The Bennett family have a party for Melissa Bennett, who's 7 years old in this picture. She was about to turn 8 years old a couple of days later. But neither she nor her parents would live to see her 8th birthday. Connie Bennett is Bruce Bennett's mother. She and a couple of Bruce Bennett's brothers come for this birthday party on January 15th for Melissa Bennett. When Connie Bennett leaves the home, she sees that the garage door is still open, but doesn't think much of it until the next day, when she receives a call from a coworker of Bruce and Deborah Bennett, who says they haven't shown up for work, so she goes to their home and sees that garage door is still open. Sometime in that night, the defendant went into the Bennett home and found all of the Bennetts in their bedrooms, attacked them all with an item consistent with a 2-pronged hammer. He killed Deborah Bennett in the bedroom. She didn't make it past the foot of their bed. Bruce Bennett put up a fight, trying desperately to protect his daughters, leaving his blood on the walls outside of his daughter's room. The defendant and Bruce Bennett tumbled down the staircase in their home, and the defendant kills Bruce Bennett at the foot of that staircase, and not leaving anything to chance, not only bashes his head in with a hammer, but slits his throat. 2 little girls are in their room. The defendant beats Vanessa within inches of her life. She does survive. Melissa, however, 7 years old at this time, does not. He beats her with a hammer and sexually assaults her. He cuts off her pajamas and he violently sexually assaults her through the injuries that she sustains, internal bleeding and external injuries that are immediately visible. We're talking about the Bennett family for this reason, and this is the only way you can consider that evidence. The judge will give you this instruction that this evidence is being presented for identity, common plan, and/or modus operandi only. You may not consider it for any other reason. So law enforcement, between the Bennett family and the Smith case, are working together. Why? Because they see the similarities immediately between these two crimes. The defendant targets homes in the metro area. These homes are about 20 miles apart. He targets homes that back up to open space. You can see on the left Patricia Smith's home backing up to open space, as well as the Bennett family residence with no fence backing up to that open space. Law enforcement checked for any forced entry. There was none, because the defendant enters through open garages. Both homes had purses dumped out. The defendant at Patricia Smith's home had dumped out her purse upstairs, taken some small items, had done the same at the Bennett family, dumped Deborah Bennett's purse outside. He left weapons at the scene. The hammer that he used to kill Patricia Smith was found under the Winnie the Pooh blanket that was covering her head. And there was a knife found in the snow in the front yard of the Bennett family home. He killed them in the same way. Blunt force injuries to the head consistent with a hammer. And the sexual assaults of Patricia Smith and Melissa Bennett were similar. They were sexually assaulted on carpeted floors with their clothes forced off. They were found naked on the bottom with blankets on their heads. Their bodies were left on their backs with their legs spread apart. These similarities back in 1984 and for decades only got law enforcement so far. That was until decades later, bringing us to this stipulation of fact, which the judge will read to you, which you can accept as true and proven. In July of 2018, law enforcement was notified of an investigative lead related to its investigation, and in response contacted Mr. Ewing in Nevada and collected Mr. Ewing's buccal swabs for DNA analysis. Mr. Ewing was not present in the state of Colorado between January 27th, 1984 and February 21st, 2020. Mr. Ewing did not have access to any locations wherein evidence was stored or forensic testing was conducted at any time. So, DNA. Law enforcement collects the defendant's DNA in 2018. Let's talk about DNA. DNA is our genetic fingerprint. We all have DNA, and it's all different, unless you're an identical twin. And DNA can come from skin cells when you touch something in trace amounts, and DNA can also come from within our body's bodily fluid, saliva, blood, vaginal fluid, or semen. Experts can tell not only what bodily fluid DNA comes from, they can also identify the person to whom the DNA belongs. Law enforcement collects the defendant's DNA. After nearly 40 years, they have a match. There's not only similarity in what we've talked about, but there's similarity in where the defendant left his DNA, because this wasn't saliva DNA. This wasn't touch DNA. Specifically, this was semen DNA, identifying the defendant to the exclusion of everybody else in the world as Patricia Smith's assaulter and killer. And there's even similarity in where he deposited DNA at both the Smith and Bennett scenes. The defendant left his semen DNA on the carpets underneath Patricia Smith's and Melissa Bennett's bodies. He left semen on the victims' vaginas, with Patricia Smith, his specific semen DNA was identified. As for Melissa Bennett, you will hear that we no longer have her vaginal lining and vaginal fluid evidence. However, there was serology testing back in the 80s. That's basically blood typing. And that blood typing on that semen matched the blood typing on Patricia Smith of that semen. And the defendant's semen DNA was also found on the blankets that he used to cover Patricia Smith's and Melissa Bennett's heads. So that's the evidence that will prove this case to you beyond a reasonable doubt. Semen and similarities. But let's talk for a minute about evidence that you won't have. You won't have evidence of the defendant's fingerprints being at either scene. You will hear that an easy way not to deposit fingerprints is to wear gloves. You'll also hear that the defendant's touch or trace DNA was not found at these crime scenes. Again, gloves would prevent that too. What you do have is the defendant's semen DNA. And what ultimately broke this case were the advancements in forensic technology, coupled with the diligence of law enforcement, who you will hear how they collected this evidence. Collecting hairs and fibers, the carpet, the blanket, swabs from genital areas. They collected that even though they didn't have the technology at the time to be able to identify a perpetrator with that evidence. In essence, that evidence was stored and preserved and served as a time capsule for future technology to be able to interpret that crucial information that evidence contained. And that information gives you the defendant, to the exclusion of everyone else, as the person who sexually assaulted and killed Patricia Smith. That's why at the end of this trial, we'll ask you to find him guilty.
And security, you have an opening?
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
There is no question that this case represents the tragic loss of Patricia Smith. And there is no question that the government or the prosecution and Patricia Smith's loved ones want those responsible to pay, and to pay dearly for that senseless loss. And those responsible should pay. The individual or individuals responsible for using that hammer and murdering Patricia Smith with it, they left their DNA, their identifying signature, unique to each of us, on the handle of that hammer. And that DNA is not Alex Ewing's. The individual or individuals responsible left their DNA, their identifying signature, on the clothes that were torn off of Patricia Smith prior to her rape. And that DNA is not Alex Ewing's DNA. The individual or individuals responsible left their DNA on the purse that was dumped in her upstairs bedroom and on the wallet that was rummaged through. And that DNA that was recovered from that purse and wallet, that is not Alex Ewing's DNA. He did not handle that hammer. He did not tear off her clothes prior to her rape, and he did not dump that purse. There is no justice in calling this case something that it's not. And Alex Ewing is innocent of Patricia Smith, and he is innocent of the sexual assault of Patricia Smith. Now, I want to take a moment to center for you the issue, really the main issue that you will be focused and centered on over the next 2 to 3 weeks. And that will be whether or not the prosecution can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Alex Ewing is responsible for the death and rape of Patricia Smith. Or to put a finer point on it, the question will be whether at the end of trial, whether one of you jurors or all of the jurors have a reasonable doubt as to whether or not the prosecution can prove Alex Ewing did these crimes. I want to take a moment to talk about the issues that are not in significant dispute. There is no dispute over the fact that Patricia Smith suffered significant injury, and there's no dispute over her cause of death. She was killed by massive head trauma. And so if during the course of the trial, over the next 2 to 3 weeks, the prosecution spends their time showing photograph after photograph of those injuries, I think it's fair for you to ask why they're spending their time doing that. So what brings us here? What happened? This event occurred back in 1984. And since 1984, the prosecution and police have desperately been trying to solve this unsolved homicide. Lead after lead, angle after angle, suspect after suspect, and nothing. Some leads were followed and exhausted. Some leads were allowed to go cold or went cold. Some leads were sort of put on hold and for future testing. Now, fast forward to 2018. In 2018, authorities get for the first time Alex Ewing's name. They receive a DNA report that links Alex Ewing to the living room carpet of Patricia Smith's home and to a blanket that is usually kept in the living room of Patricia Smith's home. Further testing also links Alex Ewing to an external genitalia swab, or the outside surface area of the vaginal area of Patricia Smith. Now, armed with this name, Alex Ewing, law enforcement, now 36 years later, takes Mr. Ewing's name to Patricia Smith's loved ones and asks if they recognize it as somebody perhaps that Patricia Smith knew, an acquaintance, someone she was dating at or around the time of her death. And they did not recognize his name. And so authorities had a quick, simple fix to this long-time unsolved homicide of Patricia Smith. And in their minds, it was Alex Ewing. But here's the problem with that quick, simple fix that authorities focused on in 2018. Number one, it falsely implicated Alex Ewing in the death and rape of Patricia Smith. And number two, it cemented in the minds of authorities this quick, simple fix that has been unmoved despite evidence that contradicts their own simple, quick fix. The prosecution, the government, needs you to think this is a simple case. They need you to think it's Alex Ewing, no one else. The prosecution needs you to look away from the physical evidence that points to somebody else. And they need you to ignore or to trust the DNA evidence that they like, but to ignore the DNA evidence that they don't like. The prosecution's theory ignores the fact that there's physical evidence that points to somebody else and that the physical evidence that implicates Alex Ewing is contaminated and compromised. The government's theory ignores the evidence and the facts that just don't fit their theory. The prosecution's theory ignores the evidence that points to somebody else committing this crime. And the prosecution's theory ignores evidence that more than one individual was involved. The prosecution's theory, simply put, is just wrong. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because Alex Ewing didn't do these things, because Alex Ewing is not guilty. And we are going to ask that you look at everything. We are going to ask that you ask the questions that the government has refused to ask. We're going to ask that you consider the evidence that the government's ignored. And we're going to ask that you ask the questions that challenge their theory. And when you do that, you will see that their theory breaks apart. So I want to talk about the moment in time when their theory begins to break apart. In 2001, the prosecution had trouble. They knew that they had no direct physical evidence linking Mr. Ewing to the hammer or the weapon used to kill Patricia Smith. They knew that they didn't have any direct physical evidence that linked Alex Ewing to the clothing that was torn off of Patricia Smith, or to the purse or to the wallet that had been rummaged through by the assailant or assailants upstairs. Excuse me. And so they took all of these critical items of evidence from the crime scene, and it was their own decision, spending their own money, to have these items tested by a state laboratory for what's called touch DNA. They had examined for touch DNA items that the suspect or the assailant of Patricia Smith would have had ample opportunity, lots of time, and would have had to touch in order to do the things that they did to Patricia Smith back in 1984. And we got the report back in July of 2021. And that report excluded Alex Ewing from the hammer handle or the murder weapon of Patricia Smith. It excluded Alex Ewing's DNA from being on the boots that were torn off of Patricia Smith, her jeans, her underwear, also torn off. Alex Ewing's DNA was not on the blouse that was torn off of Patricia Smith, or the bra or the sweater. Alex Ewing's DNA wasn't on the purse or the wallet. And you will hear that touch DNA is a type of tool, investigative tool, that is used in order to help solve cold cases across the nation, and it has been used in the state of Colorado as well to prosecute individuals. So in 2022, prosecution still does not have any direct evidence connecting Mr. Ewing to the hammer, to those clothes, or to the purse or the wallet upstairs. So what do they have? What can you expect to see during this trial? Well, you may hear a phone call between Mr. Ewing and his father, which is really just the product of confusion and frustration, Mr. Ewing trying to kind of understand how he ended up on the wrong end of this accusation. You may hear from a neighbor, or a neighbor isn't the right word, but an individual who lived in Patricia Smith's townhome complex back in 1984, who on a Tuesday afternoon in a townhome complex in Lakewood that was under construction happened to see a man who was unhurried a distance from Patricia Smith's home. And you will hear about an agreement between the parties. You may hear them argue about this agreement between the parties that between January 27th of 1984 and February of 2021, Mr. Ewing was not in the state of Colorado, and that Mr. Ewing did not at any time go into any law enforcement agency in Colorado and deposit his DNA on items of evidence in order to falsely implicate himself in crimes he never committed. Now I want to touch on the Bennett case. You can only consider the information related to the Bennett family for a limited purpose, but I will tell you that the Bennett family case does not solve the government's problems. Rather, it makes more problems for them. Why? Number one, you are going to get a sense of the Aurora Police Department evidence collection practices and the way that they kept property back in 1984. You'll find that it is unreliable and confusing. You were going to hear that the carpet that from the Bennett family home that is eventually allegedly linked to Mr. Ewing, that when that carpet is first examined by a scientist with the state laboratory in the days or weeks following January 16th of 1984, that absolutely no semen was found. It wasn't until years later that any semen was found, and then years after that it was linked to Mr. Ewing. You were going to hear about the comforter that allegedly links to Mr. Ewing wasn't examined at all for half a decade. You were going to hear that critical evidence was lost by the Aurora Police Department, including the vaginal swabs from Melissa Bennett and the vaginal fluids from Melissa Bennett. You were going to hear really about two law enforcement agencies that were desperately trying to solve these unsolved crimes, and that at times they would use the same laboratory and sometimes the same analyst to test critical items of evidence. In 2021, the prosecution made the decision to test critical items of evidence taken from the Patricia Smith crime scene. And that evidence excludes Alex Ewing from those critical items of evidence. And they've made the decision to ignore that. Now it's your turn. It's your turn not to ignore that. It's your turn not to approach this case with a biased mind, with a quick fix from 2018 that refuses to acknowledge this DNA testing that excludes Alex Ewing. It is your time to approach this case without the cemented mind of a quick fix that authorities had from 2018. And when you do that, you will find Alex Ewing not guilty.
Thank you. Do the people have a witness for us?
Yes, Norma, but I need to bring in our evidence and binders
Okay.
that we weren't able to do
Oh, correct.
with the
Okay.
jury here.
I'm going to ask that Daniel take the jury back to the jury room, and we're probably missing a chair or two, so make sure that we can get some of the chairs. Folks, you're going to go back to the jury room. You can just leave your stuff right here on the chair. All we're going to do is take the chairs out, bring in the evidence, and move things around a little bit. You can walk around freely back here, but you cannot go past my courtroom that way. So, and if you need to use your phone or other instruments, you can, but of course you can't look up anything about the case. Okay? Please rise for the jury. Do we have jury prizes for them? Thanks. Please be seated. We'll be in a recess for a few minutes while we remove the chairs, and you can bring in your...
Thank you. And we do have witnesses ready to go. I just,
Oh, no, I totally
you.
understand. Mhm. Leave that open because we're going to take the chairs out. Oh, no, that's awful.
Thank you for joining us as we explored this tragic case. If you found this story compelling, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime investigations. And as always, stay safe.